as well as how artistic activity can play a role in writing up that story. Okay, so today we will begin with Wang bringing in a discussion, maybe slightly, rerouting around the two pieces of work here on more broader questions of how his stories could be told and the problems that might concern artists and historians and art theorists. Then we have Mr. Oscar Ho, very experienced senior artist and curator in Hong Kong, to make an on-the-spot response to these questions. And also Norman will be here also to make a response to the particular issues that Wang bring up. This is not a heavily directed, editorialized discussion. We basically just come here to talk. So having the two of them as the particular respondents doesn't mean that this is going to open discussion. So we actually open the entire forum for everyone, because there are many people who have been in the Singapore symposium. Warren, Tim, who else?
Chief is not here.
Yes.
Jasper's not.
There might be one or two people coming
there.
Yeah.
So, and of course you were there.
Yes, I was there. I was there. So let's see. Before I came, I thought that maybe the discussion could go in the direction of how to work with writing up the history of Hong Kong art, side by side with the questioning the ways we deal with our history. So I think we have some very good experts here, Oscar and Norman. And also I'm also interested in history writing, so probably we have all these dimensions. And I think perhaps some of us here are more knowledgeable about others regarding the big project that is at hand right now, the West Kowloon project. Team has been following up very closely. Warren very much member of concern in that discussion. So let's see what will happen. Let's stay open for the type of issues that I have not anticipated at the end of it. So, Wayne.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's very nice that people have, like Linda said, brave the rain and come in. It's very often when you have these situations where there's a speaker coming from outside and he's not necessarily that well known, and you have a room full of people. It's very, very it feels very, very good. Yeah. I really want to thank Parasite for pushing this. Let me give a little bit of background about the exchange project. Parasite had approached us at the substation to do an exchange project, and there were some problems. We had some difficulties because we were having a lot of funding problems on our side, and the result of it, there's only me here instead of bringing the two artists as well. But Parasite was quite persistent. They persevered. I'm so appreciative of that. I'm really grateful because we had talked last year, and then Warren and Sarah came down in January, and then everybody else came down in April. And now I'm here, and I've had a really very, very enriching time. People in Hong Kong have been really hospitable, so I really appreciate that. I want to extend my appreciation for that. In September, we have our annual sort of September festival in the substation, and we're going to be bringing Tobias, who's now in Venice right now, to Singapore. So we're really investing in this sort of exchange and trying to have constant sort of travel between Hong Kong and Singapore associated with deepening an awareness of each other's sort of societies and artistic interventions into them. And I think this is a very, very important strategy for both Parasite and the substation. Hong Kong and Singapore as art scenes, while they're expanding, what is very, very clear for, let's say, individual artists who are now mid-career or even more established than that, the local scene isn't adequate to support without a very, very intense regional exchange. So that becomes very, very important for the development of arts practitioners and also for the development of audiences as well. I think it's scandalous, for instance, in Singapore, that while we might know a little bit about Parasite, we might know a little about, Ellen Pao, there really is very, very little knowledge outside of some of the, it's only a small percentage within the arts community, and outside of that it's very, very small. So I think it's very, very important to try to promote knowledge of artists, within the region, and so that they become a reference in our culture. So I think those are, part of the underlying strategies. So it's really not just about the opportunity to have exhibitions. Very often exchange projects are, I want to have another exhibition, I've shown everywhere in Singapore, let's go to Hong Kong. So it's really trying to move away from that, as an end-all for itself. Of course, there are exhibitions. Funders like to see exhibitions, so we do that. But I think the commitments are much deeper than that. And so, these last few months where we've spent a lot of time talking here have been very, very rewarding. Now, the good thing is that Norman and I have been talking a little bit about, this exhibition, so that's been very nice. And then yesterday, Oscar invited me to one of his classes, so we've also been talking. So it's, the dialogue between Norman and Oscar and I have also sort of gotten off, and it won't just start very cold. Now, but first, let me respond to some of the things that Linda said, and one tie in a little bit. So I'll talk about three things first before we break open, and then of course I've got so many other things to say. But the things that I kind of want to address are some of the thematic issues of the symposium in Singapore and this exhibition here. Then, God, I forgot what I wanted to talk about. Yeah. Okay, so that's number one. A little bit about the program. Number two, talk a little bit about the issue of space and time in Singapore, and so it'll follow a little bit from that. And then thirdly, I'll talk a little bit about the works, and from that sort of draw on to what Linda's talking about, how history, art histories and social histories. So what struck me, for instance, about the show in Hong Kong, it's the map office. They do these pictures of the high-rise housing, and so they were quite large and blown up. So you had a couple of those there. And then coming here, this is my fourth trip to Hong Kong, so I don't know Hong Kong all that well, but of course I have a lot of experience of Hong Kong visually through cinema, like many people around the world. And coming in from the airport and taking the train in, and you see these high-rises. What I was telling Laurent and Valerie last night was how my perception of them has really changed. Of course, I remember the last time I was here and I saw the buildings, but now that I saw the photographs, because if you haven't seen the photographs, they're very close-up pictures of the whole buildings, and some of them you don't even see the tops, so it looks like they go on forever. So you get this impression of the whole frame of the photo is quite large, it's just the high-rises. Some of them, you can see the tops, but some of them just, the photograph just cuts off. And it's this huge sort of just filled with the high-rise. And so you're on the train, or I'm on the train, coming in, and I see them in the distance, and what having looked at the photographs has done to my perception of the city is that everything comes so much in front of my face. It's almost like I feel my distance has changed. I'm right in front of the big buildings now. It's no longer, so distant. And thinking about like Warren, last year we showed some stuff from Videotage at the substation, and you had a work in it, I think.
It's funded.
Yeah, yeah. And then when you gave me that postcard of that, just walking around the city and looking at how the buildings cut open the sky, I sort of knew that. I've been in cities like that before, but walking around Hong Kong and having that artwork really, again, reframe my experience of Hong Kong. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's been very nice for me as a visitor to Hong Kong and someone who has some relationship with Hong Kong to see artworks that have really helped or have mediated and reframed my experience of Hong Kong. And that's a very, very nice thing. I mean, you don't always do that. I mean, people in the art field, we look at a lot of art, you can get very, very jaded because you think, okay, this artwork is about this, and then you sort of put it in a little box and you think you understand it. But when there are other dimensions of it, it's always very, very much a pleasure. So I wanted to start by indicating how my experience of Hong Kong has been sort of touched slightly by the show that I saw before coming here. It's the show in Hong Kong, the show of Hong Kong and Singapore was very much about trying to represent urban experiences, not in a total way, not having a total theory of Hong Kong, but really an anecdotal. So what I've given, for instance, in talking about Map Office's work and Warren's work, even though Warren you didn't show, you were just sort of the curator, is an anecdotal experience and registration with Hong Kong. And so it's not as if we're talking about something so grand theorizing, but these things become very, very interesting documents, as Linda has sort of suggested. What really seemed a general theme in a lot of the works was space. And I was having a quick email exchange about this show here. I was quite clear what I wanted to show in Singapore. I'd come to the decision about showing Ho Zunyan's work. One, because I knew it would be very, very interesting and attractive to the audiences here. Gina's there. Hello. And then I had been talking to Amanda, and I wanted to do work with Amanda, and then I just thought of putting the two together. So Ho Zunyan's work is about the founder of Singapore, Sangnila Utama, the mythical founder. Hanshi, have you seen it? Okay, yeah. So you should one of these days at least take a look at it, because it's a great film. Singapore was founded in 1819 by Stanford Raffles, the British imperialist dog, right, working for the East India Company. But the name Singapore it used to be called Temasek, and then it got its name changed to Singapore, which in Sanskrit is Singapura, Lion City. So someone named it, and there are real debates in history. This figure of Sangnila Utama pointed to the island and said, he's a Malay prince, said, this is Singapore, because apparently he shot a lion, killed a lion on Singapore Island. And there may have been tigers in Malaysia. There are definitely no lions in Singapore. There are no lions in this part of the world. But what's interesting is that there's a statue, a very famous statue in Singapore that probably is a good use. I mean, you think nuclear weapons should not be used for anything at all, except perhaps to blow up really ugly public artwork. But I mean, it's very, very frightening, because the Bush regime has actually been thinking about developing small-yield nuclear weapons to blow up small things like Iraqi bunkers and everything like that. So they would be like the perfect sort of power to blow up these ugly statues like the Merlion. Merlion was very much an invented tourist icon, and it's become that. It's really just it's owned by the tourism group, but it's a lion and the head of a lion and the body of a mermaid. So this Merlion sort of draws from this myth of the lion in Singapore, and there are mermaid myths around Merlion myths around Southeast Asia. I think in the Philippines, a friend has sort of researched that. There was that kind of iconography. So this one is about the desire for origins, the authentic origin of Singapore, Sangnila Utama, and how in Singapore we really so crassly invented some myths of origination. Zunyan's work is really, it's in Malay, which is the language of the sort of indigenous people to the area, but the Malay, especially around Singapore, were always very seafaring. So it was never very much sort of a major city back then, like 400, 500 years ago, or even more. Throughout what Zunyan's done is, rather than just thinking about Sangnila Utama, who is a historical figure of a lot of ambiguity, so rather than just play with him, thinking about what he is sort of a double up. So the whole idea that he might have been this particular prince, or maybe even this historical figure. So there's a lot of multiplicity already in this original figure. And so he really plays with that. And what he's done also is that he's got this figure throughout. So you have Sangnila Utama himself, but he has this sort of, if he's the prince, he has like a court fool. played by this performance artist. So they're both artists in the video. It's Zul Mahmood, who plays Sangila Utama. He's a very shy fellow in real life. And this performance artist, musician, rock star, Rizman, who plays this trickster figure. So there's a very, very interesting dynamic with that. Now, this work was part of an installation at the substation a couple of years ago that was also about painting. So what's interesting is that in a lot of the backgrounds, in some of the shots here, you have actually images from Western old masters taken, digitally copied, and then he made paintings where he would impose pictures of Sangila Utama and the trickster. And you have a sort of background, I don't know if it might be Rembrandt's, a lot of Rembrandt's in the back. And he's made paintings that look like they're old paintings, but they have a lot of digital material. So this idea that the painting is actually not quite a forgery, because in some ways it's a little obvious. It's not trying to pass for old, but it has this very, very ambiguous status of being original, or even a painting, because it's so much about digital content. And you have this very interesting relationship then between film and painting, where the painting is almost the origination of the film, and the film is almost the origination of the painting. So there's this kind of cyclical thing. So it's got a lot of formal complexity, as well as playing with historiography, or the way history is made. You can get a sense of that in the movie, even though we don't have the paintings here, because you can see some of the things. The film really proceeds like it's a bunch of stills, like a lot of paintings. So that it really has a play with paintings in it. And there's also the figure, various digressions and stories. So that's Ho Tsun-Yen's Utama. Every name in history is I. Now, thinking of juxtaposing it, I was thinking of Amanda Heng's work, and Amanda is probably better known for her performance, but she's always, even in her performance, been very, very concerned with issues of social memory. So this particular work, which was this work was actually started by the Necessary Stage, which is a very important theater company, and they did a Fringe Festival earlier this year, I think February. So Amanda wants to continue this work, so it's really a work in progress, and we're going to work with her, and she's going to exhibit again in September in Set Fest at the substation. So Amanda basically has just been interviewing a lot of people about the Second World War, because the theme of the Fringe Festival that the Necessary Stage did was art and war. But this has been a long interest of Amanda's anyhow, about older generations of people and how Singapore really sort of disconnects from human memory. There's an official narrative in Singapore. The PAP, the ruling party, the government, how they led Singapore from the chaos after the war to independence to being so prosperous. So history is there, but in a very, very dilute, in a very reduced form. It's really propaganda. A few years ago, the government had decided that the fact that it wasn't teaching history in the schools, in the primary and secondary schools, was a real problem, because people were feeling less loyal to Singapore. So they installed this national education program. And then the current Prime Minister, who's the son of Lee Kuan Yew, he was then Deputy Prime Minister. And I remember him giving a speech in about 15-20 minutes talking about how important history was. And basically, in that 15-20 minutes was all we needed to know. That was the official line. So it wasn't as if we needed to know history, we just needed to memorize his speech. So that's the relationship with history to the government, and actually to the way the government sees history having its social function. It's just needing to know certain facts and certain conclusions immediately, because then you will have a certain form of sort of cooperation with the government in becoming a wealthier Singapore. So Amanda's interest in social memory has a lot to do also with the everyday. So you have trauma, but how does trauma manifest itself in everyday situations? So she's not asking always the big questions, where you quickly come to conclusions. She actually wants to have a very messy history, a history that things don't have tied in. And yesterday, in the class, one of your students was asking, why did I call this a work in progress? And it was a very important question. I think for an artist who does research, before they really have a response, they have to live with the issues for a while. So Amanda has started this project. She's thought about it for a while, but she's actually only started the interviewing process this year. So it's really hard to say that this is a finished work of art, because just because you do a quick documentary, she hasn't really begun to frame her own response to it. So it's taking its time. So this is a work on this half of the room that's really much in process, whereas this one is quite finished. And Norman was pointing out how it's interesting that visually they jar with each other. They're a very, very different visual form, and of course they interfere with each other in the way they're installed. But I suppose if you want to see either video, this one's about an hour and this is about 20 minutes, you just go upstairs and ask them to turn one down or the other. So it becomes a little bit like a multiplex, a very cheap one, where you just get to choose one at a time. But in terms of sort of conceptually how they link together, I can't remember who emailed me, it might have been Caroline, but I needed a title for the show because I had chosen the works, never thought of a title yet. And then we're just like, oh shit, I gotta reply to this because I'm leaving for Adelaide. Okay, think for a few minutes, and then no space for time popped into my head, because it was very much coming out of our discussion in Singapore about how the artists from Hong Kong were trying to map space. But what I said was that in Singapore, it's so hard to map space in Singapore because time is how everything gets mapped. Space is always mapped by time. You're always in a hurry. And while that's true of Hong Kong as well, what I think, if you have a dominant narrative in both Singapore and Hong Kong, where we're very, very fast-paced societies, I would say Hong Kong is a far faster-paced society than Singapore. Much, much faster-paced. I mean, if you were to think of boxers, Hong Kong is like a light heavyweight. It's not maybe a heavyweight, it's a light heavyweight. It's really, but a very good light heavyweight. Singapore is a lightweight. We're not a city, we're suburbs. We're crowded, we're busy, we're very, very hectic, but we're really not, we don't have that intensity that Hong Kong has, by no means. But what I feel that Singapore has more intensity than Hong Kong is that in Singapore it almost seems like everybody is as intense. In Hong Kong you have a lot of diversity, so while you have this narrative of intensity in Hong Kong, in Singapore it's almost uniformity. Everybody is as busy as each other. We're not all wealthy in Singapore, but a taxi driver seems to be under so much stress. Everybody has this narrative of, very, very busy, very, very stressful, almost evenly. Even the development of the geography. Old buildings, they're not going to stay old, they're not going to be allowed to deteriorate, we'll renovate them. And when we renovate them, they're not really the same. They've been updated. So there's this constant sort of upgrading in a very, very uniform way, because you can do this in Singapore. It's much smaller, the government really is so pervasive. So what Singapore doesn't have, but I think Hong Kong has as a very strong narrative, is chaos. The narrative of chaos is very strong in Hong Kong, and it's very lacking in Singapore. I like to say that Singapore has no irony. There's so little, this is an island without irony. Everybody is so earnest, especially the government and responses to the government. We want to be a world-class city. And, everybody says that, knowing that it's bullshit, but they just say it anyhow. And nobody sort of laughs. I mean, there's a difference, like in Malaysia, when I was having lots of conversations with Jonathan Napak about it. In Malaysia, you have this sort of authoritarian leader, Mahathir, but he'll sort of sit back into his chair, and when he scolds people, he almost like he's laughing and smiling, in the back. Lee Kuan Yew, when he says something, he's just so serious. He never, of course he laughs at jokes, but most of the time he's very serious. So the lack of irony, the lack of chaos, I think these are very, very interesting points of difference. And how Singapore's spatially is so dominated by this singular sense of time. I'm walking around Hong Kong, and while it's very, very busy, I'm walking around this neighborhood, for instance, which is a far different time than, let's say, Central Financial District. But in Singapore, if you walk around a little neighborhood, you almost still feel the same time as in, the center, in Orchard Road, the main shopping street. There's this almost singular time, and it's very much about tomorrow. It isn't, this notion of Buddhist, let's open our hearts to the now and live in the moment. It's not that. It's like, I'm worried about tomorrow. So the government, when the government says we need to know the history and you need to be loyal to us, it's because we need to be loyal to this government because we're worried about tomorrow. It's not because we really care about what they've done, it's because they will keep us rich tomorrow. And there's that anxiety. So this idea that time in Singapore is really screw history, forget about history. It's always just today based, predicated on tomorrow. So this is this whole notion of how we relate with time. And what these two works, I think, are, what's my subtitle? Two separate artworks on Singapore's impossible history. The origin of Singapore, the impossibility of that origin, and then a trauma that is so sort of incorporated in the grand narrative of the nationalist narrative, the war. How you can sort of rediscover that in its way that it cannot be fully assimilated in the existing narrative. So that sort of explains that, and it comes also back to some of Linda's things about how do we think about history. So these kinds of artistic responses, while they're not works of history, I think they are profound responses to how we think about history. And I think that's a very, very important thing in Singapore, is when art has a relationship to thinking about history, even though it's not a historical lesson. And I really like artworks that do that. That they mediate the public through history. Rather than, I still haven't been able to think about Singapore, thinking about the public in terms of geography, in terms of space. So I'm always struggling with space. I'm always thinking about time. So even something very, very important, space, the public, I always think about it in terms of time, in terms of something like history. So maybe I'll stop there, and then we can have conversations, some responses, and then if you have any questions from you guys, just interrupt us and go right ahead.
Norman and Oscar, start
I think it is particularly sad today to talk about history, the other thing of June 4th. Because there's been so much talk about history being right. There's all these things about the Japanese rewriting the history, and all these things we talk about, and then how history being so twisted around. I'm sorry. Maybe it's not. I feel
agree.
It's ironic.
Very strange
Painful, yeah.
I can turn this a slightly different direction for a moment because I get distracted, and I can maybe talk a bit about the work for a moment, because as I watch these videos the last couple of days, I find them very visually, like I said, very visually incompatible. They're almost impossible to watch next to each other. It's like watching two screens simultaneously. But what I found that behind these images was a beautiful tension between these two works. Of one where it's a series of witnessings, right? It's witnesses telling stories, so it's about memory, right? And then the other one, you have a fictional reenactment of a possible real history, right? So there's this nice balance or play between this witnessing process and very, very straightforward and very raw and kind of unappealing image in a way, and mostly done in Cantonese and English, a little Malay. And then this one that's just primarily in Malay, but also in English too, and heavily manipulated and playing a lot with this kind of gestural look of painting and film. And so I saw a bunch of interesting kind of plays between sort of this memory and fiction, this witness and reenactment, the spoken word versus this pictorial, primarily pictorial thing, because even though there is dialogue. When I saw it, there was no sound,
Yeah.
So my first reaction was it's silent, so I was spoken versus pictorial. And then, just as you started mentioning the painting and film thing, I also saw this real relation between the indexical of the spoken word and this direct image, which is a direct one-to-one relationship from the real to that spoken word. And in the painting, in the film, this reference to the mark and the hand gesture, and it's all, there's no sense of the real. It's all fictional and all reenacted, and done in a very highly stylized way. So I found that fascinating. And then it kind of even links up, just off the top of my head, is this comparison you're making between Hong Kong and Singapore, which is like this: Singapore is even and Hong Kong is uneven. Singapore is smooth and Hong Kong is chaotic. And then it starts to play, even these two videos are playing out these sort of false dichotomies. Even the myth in Singapore, which Hong Kong has no myth except for maybe one Oscar maybe. In some ways even more entertaining than that one, but we don't, Hong Kong doesn't have that kind of, it's a mythless culture in that sense, right? But there are a lot of these comparisons. When I heard your talk at the archive, I was really surprised. If I just took the word Singapore out of everything you said about, and put Hong Kong in there, nobody would have argued with you, right? It would have been quite accurate. So I find that this notion of writing history through art highly problematic now. I think in the past it was something very powerful, but as we start to look at these kinds of games that are being played in these work, it's this very Foucauldian problemness there, this constant deferral of origins, right? This person obviously read a lot of Foucault, I mean, it's clear, and so they really love this idea of never finding an origin. But in places like Hong Kong, even if you believed in the notion of an origin, it is a true literal possibility. It constantly roots back. So who is writing the history now then, right? Because frankly, it isn't the artists in Hong Kong. It's the historians, it's the libraries, it's the archives that are giving us the sources for the history, right? And those roles are the ones I think that need to be questioned if we're going to talk about writing history.
I'm sorry. It's a difficult day. But it's interesting. I recall last month I gave a talk about noting at the Museum of Art. And after I talk about how, I'm not going to sort of explain this noting exhibition, so you can buy a catalog here. Because it's going to take a lot of time. It's about refabricating history as an interpretation of our own identity. But after the talk, Tim Tong of the Heritage Museum was really upset, and the first thing he was doing, there is real history, and as a cynic, I never really trust the history of the way history is being defined, and you have gone through all this sort of political experience, you further recognize that kind of how phony history can be. So the noting exhibition is almost like an issue about, give back the right to interpret or to write history to the people, and I think there are, I disagree with you. There's a lot of mythology in Hong Kong. It's come out in different formats, like ghost story, for example, or in function story, and we translate it in a different format, in ways to tell what happened. I mean, the convention center is actually, in fact, the Turtles Rock. It's going to sink down into the harbor. And by the time it sinks down to the harbor, Hong Kong will fall into the ocean. Now, it was reported in the newspaper by dysfunctional men. I mean, so we do have a Turtles Rock actually at the peak. It's supposed to go up to the top. But then we can always translate it to move it around. We constantly sort of refabricating this kind of mythology. But for a long time, like the Merlins in Singapore, is sort of official fabrication, and that's become true. And one thing I find is really quite interesting is when Wayne was talking about, on the one hand, there is a history, it's a kind of official fabrication of history. And that's as far as this could go. But most important, and then for the rest, forget it. Look at tomorrow. I mean, look at Donald Juan's speech about June 4th yesterday. Let's forget the past. I mean, look, everything's going fine, let's look at tomorrow. The incredible desire to erase history and to replace it with a simplistic, sharp-looking icons. That's what they call. I mean, both. I mean, it's just getting so similar that it's really Hong Kong and Singapore is actually haunting to see the similarity. I mean, the words, world-class icons and all this kind of bullshit, start feeling all these officials' mind. It's really quite terrifying. And I think we are going to a direction that exactly what Singapore is going to work. And so lately I've been involved in a project with some university students at Lingnam. So once again, it's about doing research of local history and then rewrite them and then put in personal response and actually personal fabrication. It's the same. I think it is important to get back to write history. From either is real historical, something I don't quite understand this term, or personal fabrication as a metaphor of how you respond to it. And so actually in the last few years, I think it's been cooling down. On the days of June 4th, we would go to the statues of flying Frenchmen and put flowers there.
It's good idea. It's good idea.
Because we have decided that is our own sculpture, public sculpture in memorials of the June 4 massacre. So we have the right to do that because we have the right to decide what an object means. If collectively we do it, we can change the meaning. We can change any objects into meanings we want. If collectively we have the will and desire to do it. And I think it is important we get back the right to, in terms of interpretations. And I think this is the only way we can counterbalance this overwhelming suppressive power, just getting very strong.
So I think that this, this form of forgetting history, and I think it's, maybe we don't need to think about it in Hong Kong and Singapore. It's a common problem everywhere. The Palestinians have that problem. In mainland China, everything is squeaky new, and you look at the image of the Pudong skyline, and it makes you forget June 4th. Everything is about looking to the future. I think in Hong Kong, one of the differences with Hong Kong and Singapore's history is that Singapore is a nation state, so history is normally told as national story. It's part of that discourse of nationalism from the 19th century anyway, and Hong Kong is not a nation. So it isn't that Hong Kong hasn't a history, it's got two powerful histories. One is the colonial narrative of history, one is the now more dominant national Chinese narrative. So some of that history is written here by people in Hong Kong from one or other of those perspectives, but the templates are from elsewhere. And I think that's why it's difficult writing Hong Kong history, because there isn't a template for writing histories that aren't based on nation states. And I think that's why you get these strategies of fabrication. But I think there's something difficulty of relying only on fabrication. I mean, to me, the strength of the I'm not thinking just of the locating, but of the show you did during the Hamburg. To me, one of the strengths of it was that it was a kind of fabrication of the way museums tell historical stories, and therefore a kind of deconstruction of it. But I think, to me, that's only one part of it. Is that makes you aware of how you have been eating up history without realizing it. But I think there is also the importance of truth. This is a very unfashionable word, but there are things that happened. There were massacres that happened, and we need to remember. Hong Kong is the only place in China where you publicly can remember certain facts that happened on this day. And everyone is telling you to forget, China is telling you to forget. Zhang Zemin was asked by a reporter on June 4th what he thought about it, and he said, I forgot it was June 4th. So, I think I want to speak for proper history, as it were. And yeah, I think art can participate in that, but in the sphere of contemporary art, I think often there is not that much engagement with history. Like the way we write about contemporary art often doesn't have much historical sense to it. There's not much concern for what a historical approach to things can do.
Maybe I should respond to that, because I really, I'm on your side that way. I really believe in something like a truth function. Sometimes when you think of truth as a single item, maybe that's very, very problematic, because it's always part of a process and a function and a context. And what I do feel about these particular works is that while they are clearly not substitutes, I don't think they have a cynicism towards history. I think they have a commitment to history, and they're inadequate in that sense. They're not saying that this is a replacement history, but they're trying to disturb a kind of consciousness to get us to be more concerned with history, and that I think is a very, very important function that art can have, that complements that work of real history. I do believe it's interesting, as an art writer, I don't do art history, and I greatly admire art historians. Maybe it has something to do with not being one. Sometimes you admire the people that you're not, and you distort who they really are, right? But in my own sort of theorizing, I'm very, very concerned with history, but I never do actually do the work of history. It's just not my particular pleasure, for instance. But I have a great respect for that, and I really feel my work would complement that. That's how I hope it works, because I think as an art critic, what I like to do is like what Norman was just doing, speaking to works and making the works speak back to us. So that's a certain kind of conversation that I think is, very much what contemporary criticism will do. But then really sort of contextualizing it, deepening some of the connections with a particular kind of historical perspective, that's very, very important as well. And what you just said about the lack of that, I think it's very, very crucial. And I really hope the kind of exchanges that we're doing are an investment in deepening and making more possible that development of history, even though it may not be the historical work itself, but it might produce conversations and everything, and documents that would help historians.
Yeah, I want to, before we move on from this, I want to come on the opposite side again here, because I think the examples we have of people trying to erase history are extremely specific to particular events for political expediency. And what we have is the opposite around the world, and especially here. We have an extreme overabundance of history. In fact, we're living through a memory culture, an obsession with remembering. And I think Andreas Huyssen has a great essay about this cult of memory that we lived through, from the Holocaust to the Heritage Museum in Shatin. Now, Hong Kong has numerous efforts to historicize and archive and store and keep history. And everywhere you go around the world, this is happening. So I'm in utter disagreement with it that history is lacking in the world. I would say, if anything, we have too much of it, and it's contradictory, and it's rarely criticized. And it's also never criticized in the sense of what these historical archives and things are actually doing as organizations, as what history museums are saying about it, right? It's simply brought out as truth, and we either say we agree or we don't believe or we ignore it, but there's never any criticism of the role they're playing. So I think I have to say I adamantly disagree with this idea.
I don't think we're disagreeing, because I can see what you just said. I can completely agree with what you just said, and sort of, let's say, fit it in the way what I've been trying to say. How you have these exceptional overcompensations for the fact that in Singapore, maybe America, for instance, you have lots of this kind of production of history, the historical institution in America. But of course, if you look at the recent election, mindlessness was at operation at the highest level.
But you're proving my point by saying that. That's exactly what I'm saying.
So,
history does not mean truth. There's no correlation.
So no, but when I want to talk about history, I want to talk about a real commitment to criticism of the institutions that we have. So these kinds of overcompensations, the fact that they then exist, they can there's an obsessiveness, there's almost an industry, like, the Holocaust industry, right? And that, of course, is incredibly touching, because there's been some criticisms of it that have been so hard to actually, sort of calmly think through. So trauma will come up, and when it's sort of owned, it's monumentalized, but the very, very work of it is to have a way of continually working through it and engaging it, rather than sort of clearly demarcating it for those kinds of things. So I think we're not in disagreement, and I think your point, however, that is very, very important, is this history industry. The fact that we're talking about it not existing, actually the irony is like art, art's social function is in great, we all, a lot of times we talk about, art's social relevance is, and, art is less relevant socially. We also talk about the lack of art criticism, but there's more art writing now than there ever has been. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of it right upstairs, Parasite's got so many publications, so you can see how there's this great proliferation of art material, but it doesn't have a comment, it doesn't always link. So, I think we're in agreement there.
Well, when I curated the Lujing exhibition, well, I remember I talked about it in one lecture, is that what I really want, when people come to see the show, I don't want them to believe in the show, and I don't want them to totally don't believe in the show. What I want to achieve is a sense of ambiguity and doubt. And that is what history is all about. I mean, incident happened, and they were historical fact. There were, some soldier come out killing people. The issues is interpretation of it, and this is the part that we need to do a bit seriously about the interpreter and the producer of the industry. So it is not that I want to say things didn't happen. It did happen. The problem is the essential part of our history is in fact who write it, who give interpretation, and what part of the history being sort of manipulated. So that sense of doubt, what I try to create is a confusion about history, true or false, it doesn't exist at all. But I think what's most important is to be aware of that ambiguity of history and take a more critical note of it.
When you talk about doubt, doubt's also a lot of work, because it's not just doubt to say, oh, I don't believe this, and I don't care about anything else. So the idea of introducing doubt is also to introduce a will to knowledge, where you have to start learning, because you only can doubt, there are levels of doubt. If you just sort of see something and, oh, really, I don't believe you, as opposed to saying, what really did happen? Like a lot of times I'll see a movie about a historical figure, and then later go home and Google, and then try to find out what really happened. Because I don't take the movie at face value, so if there's doubt, but that doubt requires work. So, I think, that's a very, very important thing about doubt.
So, I just want to, jump in a little bit before we carry on with the discussion. I think there are two main issues at hand here. First is about the specific role of artistic creation in the broader project of history writing. Norman seems to show a little bit of suspicion, and yet I think later on what you were talking about was actually to invite a more dialectical relation between artistic creation, and I think Oscar also got into that kind of comment. So this might be one question we want to pick up regarding the specific role of artistic creation in history, the production of history. The other would be some of the terminologies thrown out here, a lot of the questions raised were actually about how history should be written. I suggest that perhaps we can actually grow beyond the binary oppositional discourse of fabrication versus documentation. Oscar emphasized a lot the importance of interpretation. So I want to open up all of these questions. Is interpretation of that all that is about history writing? Do we always need to work at those between these two opposite ends of fabrication and documentation? What, like Professor Clark said, what exactly does it mean to write history? I am a very positive believer in history writing, in positivist history writing, but my views will come later. But let me say that there are all these two grand questions at hand, and I think it would be good that there are all of us here, and we have a couple of very contingent events at hand in this past week that would help us, tie in all these questions into around some very concrete experiences. So let's go to the floor, and I'll come back. I do have something to say in response to all of these comments, but I'll come to that later. May we know who you are?
My name is Ernst, I'm a Swiss journalist, and I've been living in Hong Kong for 2 years. And work-wise, I travel frequently to Singapore. And when I heard you talk about history, it seems to be something like linear, like where it starts and it has kind of a historic force behind that is coming out of ideology or of mythology. And what I, as an outsider, find fascinating in Hong Kong and Singapore, which both were like kind of created as commercial enterprises, not out of myth, but businessmen came very practical, had to make profit. That both of these places actually characterized or described very well by Fujiyama's essay, The End of History. With the end of kind of the Cold War, kind of when he declared that now not ideologies are there, nationalism, kind of communism, socialism, now kind of the market economy is dominating, kind of democracy is out there. Democracy not something kind of gives great sense to the world, but like something a practical way to manage kind of the state. And Hong Kong and Singapore both kind of, in that sense, are radical kind of commercial places where practical solutions are found, but they definitely don't have kind of ideology and passions as such. And I think very well in the architecture in Hong Kong, this example you used there with these buildings, these high buildings, I had the same experience. I really started